Hi again then guys, and welcome to another look back down memory lane, way back in fact to the second game in the Forza Motorsport franchise, to take a look at another very interesting car, a very different one as well. This isn't just your run-of-the-mill aftermarket parts bin special, at least that's the way some of them can look, even though of course many of them actually aren't. They are legitimate high-performance cars, or time attack cars, or drift cars, or even just a showcase of what a manufacturer can do. This one though is, as far as the aftermarket versions go, more of a purpose-built, certainly factory-built option. And as you can see, of course, it is fairly obviously based on the Ford Focus, the first generation, and this is the Ford SVT Racing Focus. Now, it's a very interesting car in the game because, of course, it was never featured since. That's the whole point of why we look at these cars in the older games, which sometimes are literally unicorn cars that you can only unlock, but more often than not, they're just unicorns in the general sense of being left behind in the franchise. And when it comes to a car like this, I think it's the kind of vehicle which not that many people will miss. In fact, probably not that many people even notice that it was gone from the franchise, even those who have played the whole series. But it's the kind of car which, in its own way, despite not necessarily being high on anyone's list to come back to the franchise anytime soon, with very few exceptions, it is the kind of car that you can enjoy for what it is and for what it can do at the time. Now, I believe it was also featured in the first Forza Motorsport game as well. It's definitely, of course, featured in this one, and it's, as I said, a very interesting alternative to many of the other cars of its type in the game. And the main reason why I say that is because back on Forza 2, and even to some degree the next game as well, you could say with Forza 3 as well, not so much with Forza 4 onwards, but back then there weren't a huge amount of really dominating hot hatches in the game. There was some, but the fact that there weren't a huge amount is what directly leads to the fact that we remember ones like the Golf R32 and the Ford Focus ST so fondly, because they did stand out. Whereas now, of course, we've got the Golf R, you got the Focus RS, you got the Mercedes A45, a number of different hot hatches, whereas with the older games in the franchise, that wasn't the case, because for one thing, the hot hatch market in the earlier to, you could say later 2000s for the most part, it was only just getting going as far as really good hot hatches went. In the earlier 2000s, you definitely had quite a few, but not so many that were in games. Specifically, it tended to be the same ones, the Ford Focus STs, the Golf R32s, maybe a Renault Megane Cup, but only if you were lucky. Whereas now, you get tons of hot hatches in a ton of different games and a ton of different franchises. And at a time when that wasn't really happening, when we didn't have as good a selection, that was the main thing that made this car stand out so much, because this is actually a hot hatch variant of the Focus, which could still give many of the hot hatches from now's games, such as the RSs and the Golf Rs, etc., a great run for their money, because this car's got a good spec. It's got 334 horsepower for a start, which is of course more than the 2009 Ford Focus RS would have in the production sense. Now, of course, being more of a competition vehicle, it's not too much to boast about compared to a road car, but still, this was a much earlier machine. And in the case of this SVT Focus, it's not just the power that's impressive. In fact, it has even more torque than power. 340 pound-feet is very impressive. Even by today's standards, that's actually really good for a hot hatch. Now, the weight also really complements the previous specs because it's super low. 1,021 kilos can actually worry most sports cars, let alone hot hatches. And of course, due to the fact that that weight is so low and the power is so healthy, the horsepower per tonne is really good for a hatchback as well. 327 horsepower per tonne. And again, you've got to bear in mind, this is without doing anything to it. Now, of course, to say that it's stock is a relative term. In a similar way to a full-on GT1 car or a prototype, it's stock from the point of view of the player. Of course, it's been pre-tuned by the manufacturer, just like this car has as well, but still, before you as the player have done anything to it, you've got some great numbers to work with. And to be fair, there's really only two potential downsides to the car if you want to look at them that way. One is the price. It is a six-figure vehicle. In fact, it's the high six figures for a hatchback at $175,000. Now, I can't recall if you could win the car. I've got a feeling that you could, but again, don't quote me on that necessarily. And as far as the category, I think that's probably the only direct downside to it. It's an A-class car at 736 PI, which is quite high. For a hatchback, that is quite high. But at the same time, it's good. It's a really fast car, the acceleration is good, the handling can be a little bit on the heavy side, which of course isn't surprising for a front-wheel drive car, and as long as you use that to your advantage, which you most definitely can, given that you can throw front-wheel drive cars, be it hatchbacks or otherwise, through tight corners in particular with much more, in effect, reckless abandon than you could with a rear-wheel drive car, or even some all-wheel drive cars, and you've got yourself some interesting potential advantages to this car. It's light, it's understated, of course that would apply more online, which doesn't really apply anymore, but overall I would say that this car is a very easily overlooked but deceptively good car. It's one of the best examples of a front-wheel drive car in the game, that's for sure. It's definitely up there with the best of them, and even though I can definitely understand why they would leave a car like this behind in a similar way to some of the others, at the same time I think it would still be good now. It would still be competitive, and although it doesn't really have a huge amount of direct rivals in the franchise, which is kind of one of the reasons why I think they left it behind, it is still an interesting car to go back and experience, because it almost runs the fine line between a full-on race car and something more like an aftermarket tuner car. It's very close between the two, more of like a club sport cup car in effect. And overall, I would say that if you do have the chance to go back and play Forza 2 at some point, this is one that might not jump out to you as much as something like a Chrysler ME412 or a Seat Cupra GT or a Silver Bullet Audi, but if you do get the chance to drive it, I'd recommend doing so at least once, because you might be surprised by how much fun you have in this. It's a very good hot hatch, one of the best in the game for sure, and if a car from this long ago in the franchise could still be competitive today, well really, I think that tells a lot about how good it was to begin with. So definitely worth a look if you go back to Forza 2 at any point. And that's it for this pick. So of course I'll see you guys next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.